What's up guys, in this video I'm going to share with you everything you need to know about Horde Chess. We're going to start with the very basics like how to play and why is the board covered with 36 white pawns, and then get to more advanced things like strategies and tips and tricks that you need to know so that you can win whether you're playing white with the pawns or if you're playing black with the pieces. I'm currently ranked 3rd overall on chess.com at Horde Chess, and I'm going to share with you everything that I've learned over the past couple of months as I've been playing. We've got a lot to cover, but I think by the end of this video, you're going to be well on your way to becoming an expert at Horde Chess. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, let's get started. Alright, so first things first, Horde Chess is called a chess variant. That just means it's a type of game that is derived from chess and is very similar to chess, but has slightly different rules. So you can see it's played on a normal chessboard, and black's pieces are the same, but white, instead of the normal 16 pieces, has 36 pawns, and no king, obviously. So if you're playing with the white pawns, you win the game by checkmating black's king. Now this can happen just with pawns, but a lot of times you end up promoting one of your pawns to a queen, and then checkmate with the queen. But it doesn't have to be with the queen, you can also do it with just the pawns. And if you're playing with the black pieces, you win by capturing every single one of white's pawns. Yes, you do have to capture every single one, and as you can see, it takes a little bit of time to even click on all of them. And I just mentioned that because if you're playing a very fast time control and you're playing with the black pieces, you have to make sure you move pretty quickly to give yourself enough time to actually capture all the pawns, even if you do get into a winning position. So just keep that in mind. If you're wondering where you can play Horde Chess at, they have it on chess.com as well as leadchess.org. I'll put links to those in the description below. I mostly play on chess.com, so if you want to add me as a friend and maybe we can play a game sometime. But there's usually a pretty good number of people playing on both of those sites, so you shouldn't have a problem finding a game. Alright, now the moment you've probably been waiting for, let's talk strategy. So how do we win if we're white with all these pawns? And how do we win if we're black with all the pieces? So the way that I'm going to explain this is in 3 parts. I'm going to start off with some very general principles that are good to know whether you're playing with white with the pawns or whether you're playing with black with the pieces. It's going to help you in both situations to know those principles. And once I cover those general principles, then I'll talk specifically about tips for if you're playing white with the pawns, and then I'll go over specifically tips if you're playing with black with the pieces. So first, let's talk about the general principles that are going to be good regardless of what color you're playing. So the first thing that you have to be aware of is that if black can get a queen or one of the rooks to the first rank, then white's pawns are gone, right? So the way that pawns capture is forward, right? They don't go backwards, they don't defend backwards. So what that means is all of these pawns are undefended, right? Every other pawn on the board right now is defended by another pawn, except the ones on the first rank. So if black somehow manages to get this rook back here, guess what? He just takes all these pawns, then he moves up, takes all these pawns, and you can see how all the pawns get eaten up very quickly. So one of the central themes in Horde Chess that you will see pretty much every game is black is trying to figure out how to get one of these pieces back here and in so that he can start taking all the pawns, and white is trying to prevent him from doing that. So whenever you're playing a game with the pawns or the pieces, make sure to keep that in mind. All right, the next thing I want to point out is that even though there are a lot of pawns on the board, they're very valuable. And if you're playing with the pawns and you give up too many pawns for free, your chances of winning go down dramatically. If you're playing with the pieces and you're able to capture some free pawns here and there, your chances of winning go up significantly. So what that means is be careful if you're playing with the pawns to not give up pawns for free. So for example, if I move here, black moves here, I move here, black moves here, and I do a random move over here, and I don't notice that black's going to take this pawn and get a free pawn, that's a pretty big mistake. You need to protect your pawns whenever you can. Don't give up pawns for free. And the flip side of that, obviously, is if you're playing with the black pieces, try to take free pawns whenever you can, and you're going to increase your chances of winning. That might seem obvious to some of you, but I know a lot of people when they first start playing, they're like, oh, I have so many pawns, I'm just going to move whatever randomly forward and see what happens. And they give away too many pawns, and you're not going to be able to win if you do that. All right, and so the third sort of general principle is that if the player with the pieces can sacrifice a knight or a bishop for 2 pawns, usually that's a fairly good trade to make. All right, so as an example of what that might look like, we'll say I play here, black plays here, I play here, black plays here. knight to d7, and we'll just do a random move. Okay, black has the option to now trade a pawn and then sacrifice a piece to get 2 pawns. So he would capture here, and after white recaptures, black could sacrifice the knight and get 2 pawns for that piece. Usually, that's a pretty good deal for black. So if you're playing with the black pieces, look for opportunities to sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns. And if you're playing with the pawns, try to prevent that. So if I back up a couple moves, instead of white playing this pawn move up, maybe he could have considered capturing, and so that pawn gets removed. Black doesn't have the option to sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns anymore. So that would have been one way that white could have prevented that from happening. So just another tip to keep in mind. All right, so now that I've talked about sort of some general principles, I want to move on and talk specifically from white's perspective. So if you're playing white with the 36 pawns, what do you need to do to try to win? All right, so the number one top priority thing that you always have to think about more than anything else when you're playing with the pawns, and I've already kind of mentioned it, is you cannot let the rooks or the queen behind here. Okay, that is your main goal. Do not let them get to the back rank or the first rank, because if they get there, they're just going to be able to take all your pawns very easily. Now, although I say try to prevent them, it turns out that if you're playing against a good player, eventually they're going to be able to break through. It's going to happen eventually, right? They're going to trade off some pawns, and then they're going to kind of sacrifice a couple pieces, and they're going to position their rook and their queen. And I'll show you an example of this later, but eventually they're going to be able to get through. So when I say don't let them get through, what I really mean is delay them from getting through as long as possible. And if you do that, you will have succeeded. So that brings me to the next point about the pawns. At some point, they're going to break through. Okay, they're going to break through and get behind. And when that happens, you need to be ready to counter push somewhere else. Maybe it's on the other side of the board. Maybe it's kind of in the center of the board. It doesn't really matter, but you need to be ready to counter push. So let me show you an example of what this looks like. All right, so here's an example game. It's just a random game. These moves are not the greatest, so don't think that I'm showing you any kind of openings or anything like that. This is just an example of what you need to do when black finally breaks through. So in this game, you see black sacrifices the bishop for 2 pawns. He gets his knight and rook set up over here. And at this point, he sacrifices his knight, and his rook comes in. Now, let's go a few moves forward. Right here. Okay, this is a crucial position. So black has eliminated all of white's pawns but the last 2, and he's got his queen and his rook lined up. Okay, if you ever see this position and you're playing with the pawns, where you only have 2 pawns left and black has a queen and a rook lined up like this, he's going to be able to break through, guaranteed. Okay, there's no way you can stop it. So let's look at an example. If I try to move this pawn forward, he's going to sacrifice it, and when I take, he's going to take with his queen, and he's got a double attack on both of these pawns. I can't save them both, right? I can push this one forward, then I lose this one, and he just comes and takes them all. I can push this one forward, then he takes this one. There's no way for me to stop. Let's go back. Suppose I don't move that forward, I do something else over here. Guess what? He still sacrifices it, and when I take back, the queen comes in. There's no way to defend that pawn, and you guessed it, he takes all the rest of them. So I hope you can see how once black gets this set up on 2 pawns, there's nothing you can do. So in this game, white did not do a good job of delaying him. It's only like 14 moves in, and we already have a breakthrough. That's very fast. You want to at least delay past move 20 if you can. Now, that being said, if you find yourself in this situation with the pawns, here's what you need to do. You know what black is going to do. He's going to sacrifice the rook. He's going to take it with his queen, and then he's going to start taking pawns with his queen, right? That's what they're going to do. That's the plan. That's how black wins the game. So because you know that, you need to start immediately. Immediately when you see this and you know, okay, I can't stop it. Immediately start making a counter push somewhere else on the board. In this case, this is where I have the most pawns advanced the farthest. Now, this is not a great setup for white, but it's the best chance that I have right here. I have to start pushing those pawns forward immediately. If I start doing some like really slow stuff, like just moving a couple of these guys around, I'm going to lose because he's going to come in, and once I start losing all these pawns back here, it's only a matter of time before all my pawns are gone. So in this example, we know black's going to take that. You want to take his rook, and then once the queen comes in, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can probably expect those are going to be black's next 4 moves, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. So what does white need to do? Start pushing pawns to try to give yourself a chance to win. While black's queen is distracted and away from the fight over here, that's when you need to go for it, right? That's when you need to go 300 style for Sparta and just send these guys forward, right? So if I was playing white in this position, I'd probably do this, because I might gain a tempo on the bishop. So let's say he retreats, and then I'm going to push another pawn. And this is where my clump of pawns is. So I'm going to be pushing, pawns in these files most likely. And I'm going to do it as quick as I can, right? I'm not going to waste time way back here. I'm going to push as quick as I can. So black's going to capture. I'm going to push another one. Let's say he takes it. I'm going to capture. So you see what I'm doing? I'm creating some threats, right? I'm giving myself a chance to win the game. I'm probably still going to lose this position because I didn't delay black enough, but I'm giving myself a chance, right? So we'll say he takes this one. I'm going to go check, right? Get a fork here. Let's say he goes there. And now I have to think, do I want to trade that off immediately? Do I want to wait and try to get this pawn pushed forward? I think that's what I would probably do. I'd push this one, try to go here next. Let's just say black keeps taking the pawns. Now, if I go there right now, he's going to sacrifice, so maybe I'll push this one. We'll say he keeps taking the pawns. Now I can push this. And you see how I'm generating an attack because black's queen is over here like just taking all these pawns, right? But that is the moment when you have to do it. As soon as they get through, you have to go fast because you don't have very much time, right? So in this example, let's say black goes here, and I'm trying to see if there's a way that I can win this. Yeah, I don't see a way to win, but let's just say I capture that. He takes back. This looks like the best chance I have, maybe. I'll go check, king up, check, and it looks like he's going to just sacrifice, and I'm not able to get through this time. But I hope you get the idea, right? That's the moment when you have to give yourself a chance to win. As soon as they break through, you got to go for it. If you don't, you're going to lose anyway. So at least give yourself a chance to win the game. All right, one more thing I'll say about the pawns is the hardest part of playing with the pawns is keeping track of everything. So as the game goes on, for example, if I go here, black goes here, I go here, and black goes here, even after just a couple moves, black has multiple threats that I have to be aware of, right? This pawn is about to get captured and the bishop's behind it. I'm going to lose a pawn there. This pawn's about to get captured, the bishop's behind it. I'm going to lose a pawn there. I have to keep track of this. And then black's going to start pushing like other pawns, who knows where, and moving knights around and moving his queen around. And there's lots of pawns that you have to pay attention to. Remember earlier I said you don't want to lose your pawns for free. So it's your job, if you're playing with the pawns, to constantly be scanning and seeing, where am I about to lose a pawn? Where am I about to lose a pawn? Like in this position, because I'm about to lose both of these pawns, I would have to capture at least one of them, and then I could maybe decide to defend this one like that. But even there, check this out. He's going to capture here, and after I recapture, look at this. I'm losing a pawn here, right? So there's lots of different ways you can lose pawns. That's the hardest part of playing with the pawns. And you also need to remember with the pawns, every time you move a pawn forward, you're reinforcing some squares, and you're creating weaknesses on some squares. So for example, if I move this pawn forward, I'm now protecting these squares, but I just weakened these squares. So if, for some reason black was attacking, this pawn, and I move this forward, guess what? It's now weaker than it was before because it's not protected. Silly example in this position, but you have to constantly be thinking about that. Every time you make a pawn move, you're now controlling some new squares, but you are creating weaknesses on some other squares. That's one of the most common mistakes I see in Horde chess. Players who, they have something well defended, but then they make a pawn move, and it's like, oops, now these aren't defended, and they end up losing a pawn because of that, right? So keep that in mind. And the last thing I'll say about pawns is when you're pushing them forward, try to push them forward together. So for example, if I move here, we'll say black does this, I go here, black does this, let's say I just trade off some pawns, and maybe I'm debating, pushing these forward. Probably a better idea is before I start getting too far advanced, bring some other pawns up to reinforce that, right? And keep as many together as possible. So like this, and I'm just making random moves for black. These are terrible moves, but the point is, you don't want to just push, your first line of pawns way forward without bringing the pawns behind to assist. You always want to move them together if possible, right? So that you always have everything being protected. If you start pushing too many forward, they're going to be weak and they're just going to get picked off by black's pieces. So you don't want to do that. All right, so we've talked about the pawns. Now I'm going to switch and talk specifically if you're playing with black and you have the pieces. What do you need to be doing? What do you need to be paying attention to? Well, again, and I know we keep going back to this, but this is really, like I said, the focus of Horde Chess. You have to get your queen or your rook to the back rank somehow, okay? Usually, it's easier to do that on the queen side for some reason, although sometimes it can happen on the king side. So what you need to do is after the first couple moves, depending on what white does and what you do and what kind of position you end up with, you need to choose a side of the board. It could be the queen side, could be the king side. Choose a side of the board and start throwing your pieces at that side of the board. Now, when I say throw your pieces, I don't mean just haphazardly, randomly sacrifice them. I mean, think about it, make smart moves, and try to trade off some pawns, and then try to find good opportunities to sacrifice a couple pieces for some pawns. Open up some space to try to set up a queen and rook combo, probably on the one of the files, right? Depending on which side you're attacking, set up a queen and rook combo and try to break through as quick as you can. If you can break through before move 20, usually that means you're going to win. If you have the pieces, you're going to win, because if you break through that early, white has not had enough time to push so many pawns forward, and he's just not going to be able to do anything, right? So that is your goal. Okay, so pick a side, throw your pieces at it, try to break through as quick as you can. All right, so now I want to show you an example of like the perfect start for black. Okay, so if you're playing black, this is kind of the goal. This is the dream. This is what you're trying to do every time. Now, most of the time, white is probably not going to let you, but I want to show you just so you know what you should be striving for to try to win. So here's an example. White plays e5, you play e6 and d6. This is how I like to start the games, e6 and d6. There are other alternatives. A lot of people like to play a5 right away, which definitely makes sense, but if white plays a5 first, you can't do that. So e6 and d6 you can pretty much always play, but we'll talk about openings later. For now, just go along with this. So a5, e6, d6, trading off this pawn and bringing this knight here. Now this is a very crucial move, and the reason is we would like to trade this pawn, sacrifice our bishop, get our knight there, trade these pawns, and you're going to see how eventually our target becomes the pawn on a4. And that probably sounded like a lot, but hang with me. You're going to see very quickly how this works out. So, and I'm just making random moves for white, which a lot of players do this with the pawns, right? They don't really know what to do, so they just kind of push pawns forward. If you're black and they're doing that, you should be able to follow this plan and get into a winning position. So we're going to trade this pawn first. That's important. Then we're going to trade this pawn. And then, like I said, we're going to sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns. And we get this setup where we have our rook and our knight attacking the a4 pawn. Okay, so very important. White's pushing his pawns forward. We sacrifice again a piece for 2 pawns. And more importantly, we've opened up the a file. Remember, this is the setup I told you about when there's only 2 pawns. All we have to do now is figure out how to get our queen over here, which is pretty easy to do. Move our bishop out of the way, and we bring our queen over. Okay, so it's move 13, and we have successfully set up to sacrifice our rook on a2, bring the queen in, and then guess what? It's just going to be time to gobble up all the pawns. And you can see white hasn't had very much time. He hasn't advanced very many pawns that far. There's no way that he's going to be able to get through all these pieces quick enough, and we're just going to eat up all the pawns. Okay, so that's the dream. That is what you're trying to accomplish. Like I said, it doesn't have to happen on the queen side. You can also do something similar on the king side, although it tends to be a little bit easier on the queen side because you can do this maneuver easier. Your king's not in the way, but depending on what your opponent does, maybe you have to try that on the king side, right? But that's the idea. Now, the next thing I want to mention is once you break through, make sure you pay attention to what white is going to be doing with his pawns, because as soon as you bring your queen over here and start gobbling up these pawns, you might find yourself in a situation where maybe your queen ends up over here in the corner and white has like a huge pawn storm and you don't have enough pieces to stop it, because your queen is one of the most valuable pieces at stopping white from pushing pawns. So let's look at an example of how this game could go wrong for me. Let's say white plays here, we sacrifice this, and then white just starts pushing his pawns, takes, and we just continue to capture pawns, and let's just say we don't even think. We're not even thinking. We're just capturing pawns. We're just capturing pawns. We're like, the game is over. It's in the bag. I'm not even going to think about what white is doing over here. I'm just going to take all the pawns, right? He takes this. He goes here. And all of a sudden, you see what happened, right? We're about to lose now. He's going to, it's black's turn. He's going to capture here. He's going to play check, and we just lost, right? We're going to have to move our king, and then guess what? He gets a queen, okay? And the reason that happened is because I was just blindly taking pawns with my queen, didn't pay attention to the fact that white was actually doing something with his pawn. Now, that was a silly example. I wasn't making the best moves for either side. The point is, once you break through, you can't just ignore what white is going to do. He's going to try to push his pawns forward. So if we go back several moves, back before all this kind of weird stuff happened, once you break through like this, if white is pushing his pawns very slowly, go ahead and take a few pawns, right? Go ahead and capture a few. But don't be afraid to, like maybe at this point, let's say, instead of going over here and taking these, maybe I could have taken this pawn, because it leaves my queen closer to the queen side where he's trying to push his pawns, right? So if I would have done that, and then, if he does this, I can take this one, and you see how my queen is helping stop the pawn push. Because once you break through, you can always move over here, go back, and go take the pawns, right? Once you break through, you can always do that. So don't feel rushed once you break through to go capture all those pawns. You have to watch wherever that might be, whatever your opponent's doing, you have to pay attention to it. So that's when I'm playing with the pawns, that's how I win a lot of games, because my opponents think, oh, well, I'm back here, and they're just like blindly taking pawns, and I'm like setting up, pawn storms, and eventually I figure out a way to get past and get a queen and win the game, right? So that's what you have to prevent if you're playing with the pieces. All right, now at this point in the video, I know some people are probably wondering, hey, aren't you going to talk about openings? What openings do you play? What's the theory? What's the best move for white? What's the best move for black? I'm going to be honest with you. Up until this point, I have not studied openings very much. I've focused on the principles, the basic ideas that we talked about, and I just kind of play moves that seem like they make sense. Now, that being said, I will give you a very basic starting point. If I am black, I like to try to play a5 pretty early, and I like to play e6 and d6. That's just me. E6 and d6 I think makes sense because it opens up your bishops, so you have threats right away with your bishops. It also opens up these squares for your knights so that you can maneuver them and sacrifice on these squares occasionally. So I think e6 and d6 makes a lot of sense. That being said, I have seen people who start the game like this, h5 and a5, and do some weird stuff on the side. It's up to you, really. Like I said, I don't know a lot of theory. If you're interested in some of that stuff, you can go to leadchess.org and check out some of the opening studies there. I think they talk about that in a little more detail. Like I said, it's not something that I have really studied up to this point. I've focused more on the principles and basic ideas, but if you really don't know what to play for black, just start with e6 and d6. Try to play a5 or h5 at some point if you can to open up your rook, and go from there. Just follow the principles. Look for opportunities to sacrifice your pieces for 2 pawns, and I think you'll be off to a good start. Let me flip the board. If you're wondering what to play for white, personally, I like to start with a5. I've talked with Rune Raider a little bit. He's the #1 ranked Horde player right now. We've talked a little bit. He seems to agree that a5 seems pretty strong as a first move. I think mainly because it stops black from playing a5, and so black can't trade off that pawn, open up the rook, and immediately start the sacrifice to open up on the queen side. Now, eventually, they're going to be able to get through after like a6 and b6, but something about a5 just seems like a decent start. And then at that point, it really depends a lot on what black is going to do. Just remember, when you're moving your pawns forward, look out for weaknesses. So like, I'm moving this pawn forward, this pawn becomes weaker, right? So if my opponent plays this idea, I have to keep that in mind, right? I also have to keep in mind that this is being attacked. So just watch out for those as you move forward. Other than that, go check out the Lead Chess studies. That's probably going to be your best bet as far as what kind of opening theory there is. Now, if a lot of people are really interested in the opening theory behind Horde Chess, write a comment. Let me know if enough people say that they want to see that. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video where we talk specifically about the opening theory. But like I said, right now, that's not something that I've really learned a ton of myself. So focus on those principles, and I think you'll be pretty good to go. Well, hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope you found that valuable and learned a little bit more about Horde Chess, how to play, and specifically how to win, whether you're playing with the pawns or with the pieces. Make sure to add me on chess.com as a friend and we can play a game of Horde Chess sometime. But as always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.